Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Kearns. I'm speaking to you today from Paris, and by the magic of modern technology, I'm joined by Joyce Tait and Alan Raybould from Edinburgh. I should maybe just introduce myself a little bit. I have had more than 30 years as a national civil servant in the UK and as an international civil servant at OECD, working always to some extent on biotechnology. And currently I'm with an organisation based in Brussels called Re-Imagine Europa. And once again, this is dealing mainly, in my case, with sustainable agriculture and innovation. So that's me. Joyce, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Thanks very much, Peter. Well, first of all, I've known you for a very long number of years because the Inogen Institute's had quite a long dialogue and association with the OECD over the years. I was the founding director of the Inogen Institute, and I've been associated with it ever since its foundation in 2002, working mainly on issues around life science, innovation, technologies, across the board, across all areas of application, and particularly how they're regulated and the ways that regulation can actually inhibit useful innovation, not contributing greatly to greater public safety, but definitely preventing useful technologies from getting into the public domain.
Okay, thanks, Joyce. Alan, similarly.
Yes,
a few words about you.
Thanks, Peter. Yes, I've been a member of the Inogen Institute for just over 2 years. I started my career in the 90s as a research scientist. You may have even given me my first research grant, Peter, I think, at the environment. So and I was studying problems associated with gene flow from genetically modified crops into wild species, and I did that for about 12 years. Then I moved to industry. I worked for Syngenta for nearly 20 years. In regulatory and product safety jobs, mainly environmental risk assessments of GM crops. And I think in both of those jobs, I've thought that often we were collecting a lot of data that wasn't particularly useful for decision making. It was making the regulatory system quite onerous for applicants. And so I became very interested in how GM crops are regulated, in particular the kinds of data we collect to make decisions about them. And I left Syngenta in 2019 and joined the University of Edinburgh, where I'm a colleague of Joyce's.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Alan and Joyce. This event that we're having today is entitled Unlocking Genetic Technologies for Agriculture. And I think it's good to remember the title as we have a discussion. So maybe I will come to you, Joyce, and I know that you've been very much involved, had a leading role in the recent report from the Regulatory Horizons Council in the UK. That's a report on genetic technologies. Would you like to tell us a little bit, maybe how you got into it and how you see a quick summary? It was quite a busy report, but if you could give us a quick summary, I think that might be useful for people.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, I mean, my involvement actually came from a long history of Inogen's research, where we were collecting case studies where regulation had a negative impact on innovation and stopped things in their tracks that could have been useful if they'd been developed further and so on. And because of that history, I think because of that history, I was appointed to be a member of the UK Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. And in that role, I led the development of a letter to the Prime Minister and her cabinet colleagues on why the regulatory systems for innovative technologies across the board in the UK, it wasn't just for genetic technologies, but why regulatory systems needed to be changed to meet the demands of 20th century innovations, because the regulations we were using were all developed in the 20th century to deal with previous generations of technologies and weren't very well adapted to the properties of today's technologies. So that began to be well understood by government. And one of the responses to that letter was setting up the Regulatory Horizons Council, of which I'm now a member. And my first job from the Regulatory Horizons Council was to lead the writing of their report on genetic technologies. And it was to do with how these genetic technologies should be regulated in the UK post-Brexit. So Brexit had a big role in the kind of easy passage of all these initiatives through the UK government, because there was an increased realisation among politicians across the board of the importance of regulations, standards, guidelines in trade negotiations. And the UK has been, of course, post-Brexit, undertaking a lot of trade negotiations, much more than they used to when they were part of the European Union. So that was part of the background. And taking all these factors into account, we felt that there's been a huge amount of discussion internationally about how these technologies should be regulated. The OECD has been leading on this since the 1980s under Peter's guidance. And there's a long history. There's a lot of baggage accrued over the years, a lot of understanding of what's gone wrong and what could be put in its place to make things better. But because of that history of that regulatory history, and regulations are very difficult to change once they're in place, people are constantly coming up against problems when they try to make changes in regulatory systems. So we decided in the Regulatory Horizons Council that we would actually go for what we thought needed to be done and not pay too much attention to what people told us couldn't be done. And one of the first things that we felt ought to be done was to stop regulating the technology and start regulating the products of that technology. So what we do today in most regulatory systems is regulate gene editing, regulate the process of genetic modification, not regulate the products at the end of the day. So we tried very hard to come up with a suggestion as to how you could actually change regulatory systems to make that happen. Basically, that's the underlying message from our report. Another really important part of that report takes aim at the current tendency for governments internationally to say that gene editing, that is the process of making small changes or sometimes quite large changes to the existing genome of an organism without adding any additional genetic material from any other species. If you're doing gene editing in that sense, then there's a widely dispersed rumour that that's definitely safer than transferring genes from one species to another. And there's absolutely no scientific evidence for that. And we feel that it's dangerous for innovation in the long run to kind of demonize gene transfer and say that synthetic biology and genetic modification are inherently different from gene editing and so will need to be regulated differently. And we felt very strongly that that was not the case. You should have a common regulatory system that applied to all genetic technologies. And that's basically the two main messages from our report.
Okay, thanks. As I indicated, it's quite a far-reaching report, so thanks for the summary. I think it's worth emphasising that upon Brexit, EU law still applied in the UK. This is across a whole range of different sectors and topics, but I think a lot of this is about adapting UK law to a current system which is essentially based on EU law. And that's very interesting for me, sitting where I do in Europe and watching current developments here. And maybe just quickly, one of the things I see here is there's a big tendency by some of the players here, and I'm talking about people in the European Commission or MEPs, members of the European Parliament, who are interested in the topic. They're very interested in making things easier for genome editing, but very fearful of going into GMOs, genetic modification, at least in the short term. We'll see how this plays out in the longer term, and it may be a very long term, but it's just worth stressing those points about EU law and what's going on here as well, which is also, there are some parallels.
Yeah.
Alan, I thought I would ask you maybe a question about the more the political atmosphere at the moment in the UK, stakeholder input, how you see public opinion going. Are there any things you would like to say about that?
I think it's interesting, Peter. It seems to be quite patchy. Certainly the government's attitude to biotechnology, as Joyce has been describing. There's a push to make regulations for genome editing less onerous, and I think there's some language from the government that this is because they see it can contribute to innovation in agriculture and other areas, and that's very positive. But also there's some strange holes. For example, the net zero strategy, I think, makes no mention of biotechnology as being able to contribute to achieving that aim. So I get the impression that the government is broadly encouraging of biotechnology, but hasn't perhaps quite thought through all of the areas where biotechnology could contribute.
Okay. And public opinion, stakeholder groups, what do you see happening there at the moment in the UK?
I don't think it's as I don't think opinions are as strongly held as they were in the early days of GM. I'm on a regulatory committee called ACRE, and we have public comments coming in about various things, and it's kind of going through the motions at the moment. They'll make the same criticisms about every field trial application, for example. Most of the points they make are outside the committee's remit, so we can't comment on them. But in essence, saying that the technology isn't needed, it's not going to be beneficial for society generally, I suppose, and that's what they're arguing about. Why field trials shouldn't be allowed. Perhaps why the regulation should not be made more encouraging of the use of that technology. But I don't get a strong sense that there's a real groundswell of opposition to gene editing like there was for GM in the 90s.
Yeah, I would. I think I tend to agree that it's pretty similar here in the EU. There's always been, as you well know, very strong activity opposing the use of GMOs, but it doesn't seem, as you said, in the EU to be quite the topic it was in the, let's say, the 90s and that kind of time period when there were intensive discussions about GMOs. So there are some parallels there too. There are differences between the UK and the EU, of course, but there seem to be some parallels in these type of respects we've been discussing. Joyce, thanks for your summary of the Regulatory Horizons Council report. Where do you see things going next? So you had quite in the Regulatory Horizons Council report, this was a pretty far-reaching looking into the future, as opposed to just dealing with, you know, the situation we have now and what can be immediately done about that. It was a bit further looking. So how do you see the future? I'm guessing there won't be more work done, at least at the moment, in the Regulatory Horizons Council, but there will be implications of the report.
Yeah. Well, there could be more work done if we can make the case for it. I think, as you said, it's a pretty complex argument that we're making, and I don't think the summary of the introductory summary actually does very well at picking up all these strands and putting them together in a coherent way for a reader who's only got 10 minutes to spend. And I think there's a good case for writing a kind of policy brief based on the report. I think that would be useful to do, and it would be helpful. I think we have to pay attention a bit more to what's happening in the rest of the world as well as Europe. And I can see the rest of the world progressing relatively rapidly to a much more enabling approach to the governance of these technologies, including technologies involving gene transfer across species. I think that will progress much more rapidly in the rest of the world. And I guess it depends whether the UK wants to be, the extent to which the UK wants to focus on Europe as an important market for the UK in future in the products of these technologies, or whether they want to look more widely to the rest of the world, because it's quite clear that even the African nations who for a long time were following the European approach to regulating genetic technologies have now begun to take a much more permissive approach in their regulatory systems. So, you know, it depends on where the UK decides to focus itself. It also probably depends on what Europe actually does. And if Europe does begin to change its approach to regulating these technologies, then I think the UK would be much more concerned about cutting itself off from European markets in the future. And I think that would be a factor. But you look at countries like Argentina, for example. Argentinian companies are making big strides developing innovative crops for Argentina, developed by small companies, not big multinational companies, following their change in their regulatory system for gene-edited crops I think in 2015. And you know, I think you'll begin to see these kinds of benefits for countries and for industries having an impact on the way other people think and on the way they think about the next generation technologies as well.
I was going to say in the EU, and I'm thinking of institutions, European institutions, like the Commission, like the Parliament, there has been a great interest in what's happening in the rest of the world. Argentina is a good example, and the lessons from Argentina, I think, are being spread into other Latin American countries. It's a good example. It's not the only one, but I think we see data from Argentina in particular and other places that actually, when we're talking about genome editing, as opposed to classic genetic modification, it does have benefits for small and medium-sized enterprises, plant breeders and so on. And that, I think, is pretty encouraging. But I know that people in Europe have been looking very carefully at what's going on in the rest of the world. And it's the same reasons. I mean, who are we going to be trading with? What are the implications of this thing for trading relations? We're talking here about agriculture, very big trading commodities. So this is important for the future, I believe. Alan.
And also, you know, Alan hinted at it,
yeah.
But a lot of the developments that will come from gene editing and gene transfer are going to be really important for meeting net zero targets from agriculture.
Yeah.
They're going to have a huge role to play, and I think that will influence governments.
Okay, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at things in the EU, like the farm to fork strategy, these are really major ambitious targets that are being set within Europe. And I'm not saying that genome editing or genetic technologies will have a big or a key role, but nevertheless, innovation in general will be absolutely necessary. Innovation in agriculture to make these things work. I mean, the targets of the farm to fork strategy. Alan, I know, and you mentioned it yourself, that you have had a lot of interest over the years in the information that producers or developers of these types of biotechnologies, in the amount of information that industry needs to provide during the regulatory process. Could you give us a quick sense of whether that's been getting better or it's worse than it used to be, or whether it's just the same?
Yeah. So I'm 2.5 years out of the game, but I don't get a strong sense that it's improving, particularly for GM. And I think, looking back, I think what happened was that a lot of the studies that the industry, all applicants were asked to do for in their dossiers were in essence assessing the technology rather than the product. I think that when we were thinking about in the mid-80s, when these products first started to be thought about, there was a lot of uncertainty about what would transgenesis do to plants, and so there was a lot of studies about have we changed all kinds of things unexpectedly, and I think that got carried over into the regulatory data requirements. I think over the years we've learned that transgenesis doesn't do particularly surprising things, and it doesn't cause harmful effects in any more frequency than conventional breeding. And I'd like to see us moving towards a system where, and Joyce alluded to this, much more where we have a set of concerns. If this were to happen, this would happen. If that were to happen, we'd be concerned about it, and we should be looking for that, rather than what we've tended to do is to see what's changed and then think about whether what's changed has been important or not. So I'd like us to get much more towards a system where the regulators are defining what they see as being a problem, and then the applicant would look for it, rather than the applicant looking at what's changed in their product compared with the control, and then having to argue whether or not that's important. So I think we need to change the emphasis really, and I think the industry probably wouldn't like this, but you could also see that working on the opportunity side. If the product has this kind of characteristic, say for net zero targets, then that would be seen as being beneficial. I know the industry doesn't like regulators necessarily getting involved in defining what the advantageous points of their products are, but I just wonder whether that actually might make a difference and help to get the products onto the market if the regulators are also saying what they want to see as well as what they don't want to see in their products.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Joyce, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things that has happened in the UK is that DEFRA, the Department of Environment and Rural Affairs, that is the main regulator involved in these products. DEFRA have recently made changes, and I think the legislation is going through Parliament just now, to allow companies to use a much softer approach to basic field trials during the research stage of developing a product. So they've more or less removed most of the data requirements at that stage in development of a product, and this is seen as the beginning of the UK moderating its approach to how we regulate these technologies. And it's qualitatively, it's a really dramatic change. Quantitatively, I've talked to some colleagues, and their assessment is that it will take about £10,000 to £20,000 out of the cost of development of a new crop that's been genetically modified, genetically edited. And that's, if you think the total cost is in the millions, I think hundreds of millions of pounds of developing a new variety for a major crop is not going to make much difference to the decision, go or no go, with actually developing a product for a market. They will want to see, the developers will want to see dramatic changes further downstream, reducing the cost of the regulatory compliance before they will actually make a go no go decision on developing a new crop. So it's welcome, but it's a much smaller change than they're currently trying to.
I think what it may do, Joyce, is allow more experiments to be done, more products to be evaluated a little bit further down the line out of the laboratory. And I agree with your point about the way that regulations, if the regulations for gene editing are done well, then that could allow many more organisations to commercialise products, small businesses, maybe even the public sector. And I noticed this when I joined Syngenta in 2001. There was a huge variety of projects, GM projects. Then, after being in the company for about 5 years, all the interesting stuff had disappeared, and it was the boring stuff like herbicide-tolerant maize and insect-tolerant soybeans or whatever it was. I'm not saying those products were not important, but I wouldn't say they were hugely innovative in the sense of doing something radically different from what was already happening. So it's interesting, and often the first question that you would have when you had a product idea was how would this be regulated? Not what value can it give society, give farmers, whatever, but how will this be regulated? And often that would be if the answer was a bad answer, if it would be treated as GM, for example, then the project would be killed. And so that constraining effect on innovation of regulations is really large, even in huge companies like Syngenta that can afford to put products through the regulatory system. It very much affects their decision making about early stage products, and I think it pushes it towards these products that are you can sell them worldwide. They fit into existing systems. It very much steers them away from taking risks, new types of products, maybe niche markets, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, if things develop in a way I think we would all like them to develop, and if there's something a little bit more like the Argentina system, I think because that affects everything in the way you were describing. It affects what things you decide to work on and develop in the first instance. If you know that you're going to have at the end of it, let's call it a lighter regulatory system than, say, for classic genetic modification. I think that's a very good reason for us all to keep a more global watch on what's going on, because we can all benefit ultimately from learning the lessons of others. And I'm thinking also, going back to something you were saying, Alan, about the way risk assessment is approached. If that does evolve, it's very useful if it evolves in a global system, or in a global way, because then people developing products can approach different regulatory systems with more or less a similar approach.
I think there was something very different about the European system, in that it almost became that the regulatory system was the forum where the policy was trying to be sorted out. It wasn't something that had evolved from a policy discussion. It was the place where the policy discussion often seemed to happen, and that's why often you'd be asked for data from the European regulators. You'd provide it, and then something else would go on. It was almost like they were trying to resolve what the policy was through asking you for data.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably a fair comment. And well, as you know, there are big differences between EU member states on their approaches to these things. And so that's part of the problem, especially in the Council of Ministers in Brussels. Anyway, I think we've run out of time. So time passes quickly when it's a good discussion. So Joyce and Alan, thanks very much for joining me today. And I wish you all the best in the next steps for both of your work and for Inogen, the Inogen Institute more generally. Thanks very much.
Thank you.